labeled overstepping and axed. I dropped cheating audio as revenge. He's ousted. Merger collapses. My name is Lydia Hart. At 8:46 on a Friday morning, I was the director of risk analytics at Denton Vale Energy, a title I had held for 7 years and built from the ground up. I walked toward the 40th floor glass-walled conference room, the one reserved for the board, my laptop open in the crook of my arm. The screen glowed with the final budget reconciliation for the Ousted acquisition, a $3.1 billion deal that was supposed to be my masterpiece. The numbers on the spreadsheet were clean, precise, and irrefutable. They were also, as I was about to discover, the reason for my corporate execution. The air in the executive wing was different today. Usually, it hummed with a low-frequency thrum of ambition and controlled panic. This morning, it was silent, not peaceful, but predatory, the silence of a held breath. My heels made sharp, distinct clicks on the polished marble, each one an announcement of my arrival. Through the glass, I could see them waiting. Grayson Bell, our CEO of 18 months, sat at the head of the long obsidian table. To his right was Marcus Thorne, the company's general counsel, a man whose face was a permanent mask of bored condescension. To his left sat Sarah Jenkins from Human Resources, looking pale and clutching a ridiculously thin manila folder as if it were a life raft. The massive presentation screen behind them was active. Its default Denton Vale logo cast a cold blue light across the room, reflecting like an oil slick on the dark glass behind them. They looked like a tribunal assembled and waiting for the condemned. I was the condemned. I pushed the heavy glass door open. It swung inward with a silent hydraulic sigh. "Grayson, you wanted to see me?" I kept my voice even, professional. My laptop was still cradled in my arm, the acquisition model glowing, proof of my value, proof of my work. Grayson offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, flat and cold. "Lydia, come in. Close the door." I did, and the silence became hermetically sealed. I walked to the table but didn't sit. I placed my laptop down, its light joining the blue glow on the polished surface. I was ready to walk them through the final risk variables, to point out the subtle financial traps I'd uncovered in Ousted's environmental liability reports. I thought that's what this was about. A final high-level review before the board meeting at 9 o'clock. Lydia Grayson began, his tone as casual as if he were ordering coffee. "We've decided to let you go." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, stripped of meaning. I stared at him, my mind trying to parse the statement, to find the context I was missing. Was this a joke, a bizarre power play? But then I looked at Sarah from HR, who was now intently studying the wood grain of the table as if it held the secrets of the universe. I looked at Marcus, who was examining his cuticles. No, this was real. "Let me go?" I repeated the words, feeling foreign in my mouth. "I don't understand." Grayson leaned forward, steepling his fingers. It was a gesture he'd copied from a magazine profile of a more successful CEO. "Your employment with Denton Vale Energy is terminated, effective immediately. We've assessed the situation and feel this is the best path forward for the company." My mind, usually a seamless engine of logic and probability, stalled. I could model the financial collapse of a mid-sized nation, but I hadn't modeled this. "The best path forward? Grayson, the board meeting is in 15 minutes. I'm scheduled to present the final risk assessment for the Ousted deal. The board has been informed that your presentation will not be necessary." Marcus, the lawyer, interjected, his voice a dry rustle of paper. He slid the thin manila folder across the table. It stopped a few inches from my hand. "This contains your severance agreement. It's quite generous, conditional on the signing of a standard non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement." My focus snapped back to Grayson. The shock was receding, replaced by a glacial anger. On what grounds? Repeated overstepping of authority during the acquisition prep. Grayson stated the phrase clearly, rehearsed. He recited it as if reading from a teleprompter only he could see. The accusation was so absurd, so fundamentally untrue, that a laugh almost escaped me. I swallowed it down, letting it turn to ice in my veins. I had built the entire analytical framework for this deal. I had spent sleepless nights running simulations, stress testing data, and building the complex financial model that made the $3.1 billion valuation possible. My authority wasn't overstepped. It was the very foundation they were standing on. Overstepping. My voice was low, devoid of the emotion they expected. They wanted tears or shouting. I would give them neither. Overstepping. Where exactly? In the $3.1 billion model I built for you, the one that flagged the inflated valuation of Wellfield 27, is that the authority? I overstepped the authority to do my job. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Grayson's face, annoyance. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned. He was a salesman who had ascended to the throne, a man who dealt in charisma and bold promises, not in the hard, inconvenient truths of data. I was an inconvenient truth. Sarah from HR looked up, her eyes pleading. "Lydia, please, let's not make this more difficult." She avoided my gaze, her eyes darting around the room, landing everywhere but on me. It was the look of someone who knew a profound injustice was being committed but lacked the courage to speak. She was afraid of catching whatever disease I had, the disease of integrity. "This is everything you need," Marcus said, tapping a polished fingernail on the folder. "Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings. Your network access has been revoked." The finality of it was a physical blow. Revoked. I was erased. In the space of 5 minutes, 7 years of my life, my entire professional identity had been deleted with a few keystrokes. I looked at my laptop. Its screen still displayed the elegant architecture of my work. It was now a useless brick. I didn't touch the folder. I looked directly at Grayson Bell. "You're making a mistake. I said it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, a risk assessment." He simply smiled again, that empty, chilling smile. "The board feels confident in my leadership. That will be all." I turned without another word and walked to the door. My legs felt steady, my back straight. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. As I pulled the heavy door open, I could feel their collective exhale of relief behind me. The crisis was averted, the problem was removed. I stepped out into the executive wing and saw my assistant, Chloe, standing by her desk, her face ashen. She knew. The entire floor knew. The silence wasn't predatory anymore, it was funereal. No one met my eye. I was a ghost. A large, impassive man in a security uniform was waiting for me. He nodded curtly. "Miss Hart, this way." He followed me to my office, the one with the view of the city skyline that I had worked so hard for. I packed my things into a cardboard box, a framed photo of my sister, a collection of industry awards, a worn copy of The Intelligent Investor. It took less than 10 minutes. As I was unplugging the small lamp on my desk, I glanced at the sleek, wall-mounted console for our teleconferencing system, Blue Wirecomp, a state-of-the-art platform I had personally selected and championed for its superior recording and archival features. We used it for everything, especially for investor calls and board meetings, to ensure a perfect, auditable record. The quarterly board review, scheduled to begin in a few minutes, would be running on it. And that's when the cold, analytical part of my brain, the part they had just fired me for, kicked back into gear. They were so efficient in their erasure. They cut my network access, locked my email, deactivated my keycard. They had followed the corporate executioner's handbook to the letter, but they had forgotten one thing, one critical detail. The acquisition call from earlier that morning, the one where Grayson had dismissed my concerns about the Orstar deal and told his inner circle to bury the environmental report, was conducted using that same system. And I, as the system administrator, had set the default protocol for high-level acquisition meetings, continuous encrypted recording to a secondary server for compliance purposes. The recording didn't terminate when the call ended. It terminated when the session was manually closed, by the administrator, by me. They had fired the one person with the authority to stop the recording. They thought they had silenced me, but they had left my microphone on. The system was still listening. It was still recording every whisper, every boast, every lie that would be spoken in that room for the quarterly financial report. The security guard cleared his throat, impatient. "Ma'am." I picked up my box of personal effects. "I'm ready." He escorted me to the elevator bank. The doors slid open with a soft chime. As I stepped inside, I turned and looked back down the long, silent corridor. It was the last time I would see it. The doors slid shut, encasing me in a mirrored cube of brushed steel. I pressed the button for the ground floor and watched the numbers above the door begin to descend. 40, 39, 38. The building was shedding floors, dropping me back to the street. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel. My face was calm, my expression unreadable. I was falling, but as I watched the numbers continue their swift, silent descent, I knew with the absolute certainty of a perfectly calculated risk that someone else would be falling much farther and much faster than I was. Grayson had just started his own freefall. He just didn't know it yet. The deal was a god. That's the only way to describe it. In the hallowed halls of Denton Vale Energy, the Orstar Resources acquisition wasn't just a merger, it was a corporate transfiguration. $3.1 billion. The number was whispered in meetings, typed in the subject lines of urgent emails, and toasted with overpriced scotch at hushed happy hours. It was a number that promised salvation from a decade of stagnant growth and middling stock performance. It was the chariot that our new CEO, Grayson Bell, was going to ride into the pantheon of Wall Street legends, and we, the executive team, were meant to be strapped in right behind him, rocketing toward a future paved with gold-plated stock options. I remember when Grayson arrived, a whirlwind of tailored suits, charismatic speeches, and blindingly white teeth. He came from private equity, a world where companies were not entities to be nurtured but assets to be stripped, polished, and flipped for a spectacular profit. He spoke a language the board adored, a slick dialect of synergistic value creation, disruptive innovation, and maximizing shareholder returns. He promised to take Denton Vale, a respectable but dull player in the domestic energy market, and launch it onto the international stage. Orstar Resources, with its supposedly vast and untapped reserves, was the key. He sold the vision, and everyone, from the seasoned veterans on the board to the ambitious junior VPs, bought it without question. They were desperate for a messiah, and Grayson played the part to perfection. While they were worshipping at the altar of the deal, I was the one down in the digital catacombs, building the church. I was the sole architect of the comprehensive risk model for the acquisition. It wasn't just a spreadsheet, it was a living ecosystem of data, a complex algorithm I had coded and refined over 4 sleepless months. It ingested 6 years of geological surveys, satellite thermal imaging, EPA compliance reports, historical production logs, and competitor analysis. It simulated market volatility, calculated geopolitical risk, and projected operational expenditures down to the last drill bit. Grayson sold the poetry of the deal. My job was to write the unsparing, unromantic prose. My model was the only thing that could tell us if this $3.1 billion god was real or just a beautifully crafted idol. For weeks, the model purred. The numbers were strong. The synergies, while not as stratospheric as Grayson claimed in his investor pitches, were solid. Then, late one Tuesday night, surrounded by the faint hum of my workstation and the ghosts of cold coffee cups, I found the heresy. It was buried deep in the asset valuation data for a specific mining operation, Orstar's crown jewel, field number 27. On paper, it was a titan, the single most valuable asset in their portfolio, responsible for a hugely disproportionate amount of the company's projected future earnings. It was the load-bearing pillar holding up the entire valuation. The investor-facing production logs, the ones Orstar had supplied in their data room, showed a smooth, beautiful upward-trending curve of output. But something felt wrong. It was too perfect. Real-world mining operations have hiccups, maintenance shutdowns, geological inconsistencies. This looked less like a report and more like a marketing brochure. So I started digging deeper, cross-referencing the logs with raw, unstructured data I'd pulled from supplemental appendices, the kind of boring technical files most analysts ignore. I overlaid satellite imagery from the past 3 years. I analyzed maintenance manifests and equipment purchase orders. The truth began to emerge, pixel by pixel, data point by data point. The satellite thermal imaging showed significantly less activity at the site than claimed. The maintenance logs revealed persistent, costly equipment failures they hadn't disclosed. The core sample data suggested the richest seams were close to depletion. Wellfield 27 wasn't a titan. It was a tired old man wearing a superhero costume. Its reserves were a fraction of what was claimed. Its output was declining and its operational costs were about to skyrocket. They had taken the well's peak performance from 4 years ago and extrapolated it into an infinite future, ignoring every piece of evidence to the contrary. The asset hadn't just been overvalued, it had been deliberately, systematically inflated by a factor of at least 3. The pillar holding up the deal was hollow. I ran the numbers again and again. The conclusion was the same. The $3.1 billion valuation wasn't just optimistic, it was fraudulent. The next morning, I submitted my preliminary findings in a 40-page report, complete with appendices, charts, and source data. I flagged Wellfield 27 with a designation of critical risk, high probability of material misstatement. I recommended an immediate independent third-party geological audit before proceeding. I was, I believe, doing my job. I was protecting the company. I was summoned to Grayson's office an hour later. The report was on his desk, untouched. "Lydia," he said, that easy smile firmly in place. "Good work, very thorough. A little intense, but thorough." "The data is concerning," I said, remaining standing. "If the reserves at 27 are misstated, the entire financial rationale for this merger collapses." He waved a dismissive hand. "It's just conservative accounting from their end. They're sandbagging. We'll get in there and unlock the real value. You're a risk analyst. I get it. Your job is to find the storm clouds. But I'm the one flying the plane. I'm telling you the skies are clear." "This isn't about pessimism, Grayson," I countered, my voice firm. "This is about empirical data. The thermal scans don't lie. The maintenance logs don't lie." His smile tightened. "Look, I need you to be a team player on this. The street is ecstatic about this deal. Our stock is already up 12% on the announcement. We can't let internal anxieties derail this kind of momentum. I need you to go back to the model and tone down the negative assumptions. Adjust the risk weighting. Frame it as a potential opportunity, not a liability." "You want me to change the data?" I asked, incredulous. "I want you to change the narrative," he corrected smoothly. "Tell a better story. That's all business is, Lydia, storytelling." I refused. I told him I would stand by my report and my professional assessment. That was the moment I became a problem to be managed. The isolation was subtle at first, then absolute. My name was quietly dropped from the distribution list for the M&A steering committee. Invitations to the daily audit prep meetings with our external accountants stopped arriving. Crucial data files were suddenly routed through Grayson's new VP of strategy, a 28-year-old sycophant named Mark, who wouldn't know a geological survey from a dinner menu. Then came the final insult. Grayson tasked me with preparing the official minutes for the very audit meetings I was now barred from attending. They would send me the call recordings, and I, the company's foremost expert on the underlying data, was to act as a glorified stenographer. They needed my meticulous attention to detail to create a clean, defensible paper trail, but they could not tolerate my voice, my questions, or my integrity in the room where decisions were being made. That was when I started building my own archive. They thought they were sidelining me, but they had given me the perfect vantage point. They had made me the official keeper of their records. I created a folder on a secure personal partition of my drive. I didn't hide it, but I gave it a name so bland and technical it would never attract attention: Compliance Audit Backup Q3. Inside, however, the subfolder was named Echo, because I knew their words would one day echo back at them. I began saving everything, every version of my Wellfield 27 report, with timestamps proving what I knew and when I knew it, every email from Grayson urging me to be a team player, every evasive response from the Orstar team. And most importantly, I saved the raw audio files from the audit calls they sent me to transcribe. I didn't just write the minutes. I preserved the full, unedited recordings, the hesitations, the sarcastic asides, the moments when Grayson would tell the accountants, "Lydia's team has reviewed this and sees no major issues," while my report stating the exact opposite was sitting on his server. They thought I was just a data controller, a librarian of facts they could manipulate. They failed to understand that a person who truly controls the data also controls the truth. They thought they were creating their own narrative. I was simply creating a perfect, unalterable recording of theirs. I was no longer just analyzing the risk to the company. I was documenting the risk that was the company's leadership. And in the folder named Echo, the truth sat waiting patiently for the right time to speak. The beginning of the end came exactly 1 week before they fired me. It happened in the quiet, carpeted corridor outside the main boardroom. The air was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and simmering tension. An emergency meeting of the investor relations team had just concluded. A meeting I was not invited to. Grayson and his inner circle, 4 men I'd worked with for years, now his loyal lieutenants, were walking out, their faces a mixture of forced optimism and fatigue. Grayson saw me standing by the window, reviewing a document on my tablet. He changed his trajectory, intercepting me. His approach was casual, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "Lydia," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for me, though the others slowed their pace to listen. "We need to talk about your extracurricular activities." I looked up from my screen, keeping my expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean, Grayson. The calls, he said, the smile not leaving his face but becoming something sharp and dangerous. You've been reaching out to contacts at the pension funds, making inquiries about the Ousted due diligence process. I need that to stop. You're interfering with the investor coordination. My blood ran cold, but I didn't let it show. He was right. I had made 2 discreet calls to former colleagues, now senior analysts at major institutional investors. I hadn't shared any proprietary data. I had simply asked vague, probing questions, testing the waters to see what narrative Grayson's team was spinning. I was doing my job, assessing external risk perception. I'm not interfering, I replied, my voice as quiet and level as his. I'm checking. There's a difference. That was when the mask slipped. The smile vanished, replaced by a flash of raw fury in his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. He took a half-step closer, invading my personal space, forcing me to tilt my head back slightly to maintain eye contact. It was a classic alpha male power move, as subtle as a punch to the jaw. He leaned in, and his voice dropped even lower, becoming a venomous whisper. You're being emotional, Lydia. The words hung in the air between us, aimed with surgical precision. It was the oldest weapon in the book, the one pulled from the arsenal when logic and facts fail. He wasn't attacking my work, he was attacking my gender, framing my rigorous, data-backed diligence as some kind of hysterical outburst. Leave the numbers to us, he added, patting my arm in a gesture of grotesque condescension. We'll handle it from here. He then turned and walked away, his 4 shadows falling in step behind him. One of them, a VP named Dave, who I'd once mentored, let out a short, nervous chuckle. The other 3 just stared intently at their laptops, as if a sudden critical email had just arrived for all of them simultaneously. I watched them go, a phalanx of well-tailored cowardice. And in that moment, I understood completely. It wasn't that they were afraid of being wrong, they were terrified of someone being right. My adherence to the truth was a spotlight, and they were all desperately trying to stay in the shadows, hoping it wouldn't illuminate the fact that they had sold their spines for a shot at a bigger bonus. That night, I couldn't sleep. Grayson's words echoed in my mind, leave the numbers to us. He wasn't just sidelining me, he was actively taking control of the data itself. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I got out of bed, went to my home office, and logged into the Denton Vale network through a secure VPN. I told myself I was just going to run a final diagnostic on the valuation models, a last check for any vulnerabilities. But I knew what I was really doing. I was looking for the fingerprints. I started with the master file for the acquisition, the central repository for all financial projections. I ran a version history report. As expected, there were dozens of legitimate updates from my team in the finance department over the past few weeks. But then I looked at the server access logs for the file directory itself. My screen filled with lines of code, a river of timestamps, and user IDs. I filtered the results, searching for any access outside of normal business hours, any modifications from non-authorized users. And there it was, a single line of text that made the air in the room feel thin and cold. File modification, orstar.revise.xlsx. Timestamp, 02/17/14. User ID, gbell.hadmin. 2:17 a.m., an hour when honest work is never done. And the user ID wasn't his standard executive account, it was his administrative-level account, the one with godlike permissions, the one that could alter data without leaving the usual tracks. He hadn't just told someone to change the numbers. He had logged in during the dead of night and done it himself, clumsily, renaming the master forecast model Orstar.revised. It was the digital equivalent of a killer returning to the scene of the crime and accidentally dropping his driver's license. He had personally manipulated the core assumptions of the $3.1 billion model, hard-coding the inflated values for Wellfield 27 and erasing the risk variables I had built in. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it, the smoking gun. This was the unambiguous, undeniable proof of deliberate fraud committed by the CEO himself. My training, my instinct, my entire career had been about mitigating risk, and this was the biggest risk I had ever seen. I moved with cold, detached precision. Years ago, during a system overhaul, I had built a secret digital failsafe into our email server. I called it an audit mirror. It was a ghost address, a black box that existed outside the normal directory. Anything sent to it was instantly encrypted, duplicated across 3 separate off-site servers, and logged with a tamper-proof timestamp. It was an insurance policy I had created and hoped I would never need. I composed a new email. The recipient was audit_mirror@din.net. The subject was a meaningless string of characters. In the body, I embedded the screenshot of the server log. I attached the original untouched financial model from my Echo folder. I attached the doctored orstar_revised.xlsx file. I wrote a single line of text, discrepancy noted. Timestamp, 2:17 a.m. I set up an automated recurring rule on a delay timer. The system would archive the evidence package every hour on the hour until I manually entered the kill code. The evidence was now secure, redundant, and beyond his reach. If they erased me, the mirror would still hold my reflection. The next morning, I saw Grayson by the elevators. He looked rested, confident, a man who believed he had won. He saw me and smiled that brilliant, empty smile. "Lydia," he said, his tone suggesting we were old friends clearing up a minor misunderstanding. "I hope we're on the same page now. We can't work with distrust in the executive suite." He expected me to be chastened and subdued, perhaps even apologetic. He thought his little display of dominance had put me back in my box. I looked him directly in the eye, my face a calm mask. "I agree," I said. My tone was even, my expression unreadable. He could interpret it however he wanted, and he did. He saw it as my surrender. He nodded, satisfied, and stepped into the elevator. What he didn't hear was the full meaning of my words. I agree. We can't work with distrust. And he was the most untrustworthy man I had ever met. As the elevator doors closed on his smiling face, I knew. My career at Denton Vale was over. It was no longer a question of if, but when. The final act had begun. I was living in the 11th hour, a ghost walking on borrowed time. But I was a ghost who had already set the stage for the haunting to come. The walk from my office to the main lobby was the longest of my life. Each step was a deliberate, measured act of control. The cardboard box in my arms wasn't heavy, but it felt dense with the gravity of my truncated career. It held the mundane artifacts of my 7 years at Denton Vale, a worn coffee mug, a few framed industry awards that suddenly seemed ridiculous, a stack of technical journals. The security guard, a man named Frank, whose name I knew because I made a point of knowing everyone's name, walked a respectful 2 paces behind me. He was just doing his job, but his presence was a constant, humiliating reminder of my new status, exile. My laptop, which had been wiped and locked by IT before I was even allowed back to my desk, was a dead weight in my bag. They had severed my digital limbs with brutal efficiency, cutting off my email, my network drives, my building access. They thought that by taking my keys, they had taken my power. They were wrong. As we passed the bustling open-plan area of the analytics department, my team, a hush fell. Heads that had been bent over screens lifted, then quickly dropped again. No one would meet my eye. I was a leper, and they were terrified of contagion. I didn't blame them. In the kingdom Grayson was building, loyalty was currency and compassion was a liability. What none of them knew, what even the smug-it technicians who had erased my digital life didn't know, was that one connection remained, one thread they hadn't thought to cut, the Blue Wire conferencing system. I had spec'd it, I had overseen its installation, and I had, with the board's approval, built in certain administrative backdoors for high-level diagnostics and compliance monitoring. It was my system, and it was still running. As Frank and I stepped into the glass elevator, the polished steel doors sliding shut, the clock on the digital display read, "Up on the 40th floor, in the boardroom I had been ejected from less than an hour ago, I knew the call was starting. Grayson would be at the head of the table, radiating confidence. He was convening a final pre-board meeting strategy session with his senior VPs and the lead negotiators from Orstar Resources. It was meant to be a victory lap, a final alignment before the public announcement. I had been deleted from the official participant list, my name erased from the calendar invite. But they had only deleted the user profile, Lydia Hart. They hadn't deleted the system's core administrative link, a diagnostic tool that functioned like a ghost mic connected through a secondary server I had set up in our Frankfurt data center. It was a listening post they had forgotten existed. The elevator began its smooth, silent descent, 35, 34. While my body was moving down, my mind was 40 floors up in that room. Through the earbuds connected to my phone, I wasn't listening to music, I was listening to them. The audio was crystal clear, a high-fidelity stream of their self-congratulation. I heard Grayson welcome everyone to the call, his voice booming with false bonhomie. I heard the sycophantic laughter of his VPs. I heard the smooth, confident tones of the Orstar team, blissfully unaware of the lie at the heart of their prize asset. I didn't need to be in the room. I had run the simulation of this conversation in my head 100 times. I knew the script. We reached the ground floor. The lobby was a vast marble cavern, echoing with the sounds of a company at work. Frank escorted me to the main security desk. "She needs to be signed out," he told the guard on duty, a woman I didn't recognize. She looked at me, then at the box, her expression a careful blank. "I need your badge, Ms. Hart," she said. As I unclipped the plastic ID card from my belt, the card that had been my key to this kingdom for 7 years, I heard Grayson's voice through my earbuds, clearing his throat to make an announcement. "First, a bit of housekeeping," he said. "As some of you know, we've made an executive change this morning. Lydia Hart is no longer with the company." I slid my badge across the cool marble countertop. The guard took it without a word. I was officially out. A brief, calculated pause on the call. Then Grayson continued, his tone shifting to one of solemn, feigned regret. "It's an unfortunate situation. Lydia is a brilliant analyst, but she allowed her personal feelings to cloud her professional judgment on this deal. She began to exaggerate the environmental risks, creating unnecessary friction with our partners and costing us a significant amount of investor trust." I picked up my box. It was a masterful performance. In 3 sentences, he had destroyed my reputation, painting me as an emotional, unreliable woman who couldn't handle the pressure of a high-stakes deal. He was preemptively discrediting any noise I might try to make from the outside. The narrative was set. I was the problem, and he was the decisive leader who had solved it. I turned and walked toward the revolving glass doors, my final steps inside Denton Vale Tower. Frank nodded at me, a flicker of something, pity, respect, in his eyes. "Good luck, Miss Hart." "You too, Frank," I said. As I pushed through the revolving door and stepped out onto the sun-drenched sidewalk, the noise of Manhattan hitting me like a wave, I heard one of Grayson's VPs, Dave, the one who had laughed when Grayson insulted me, ask a question on the call. His voice was laced with a slight nervousness. "Grayson," he asked, about the board review. "Hart's last model had some pretty aggressive flags on Wellfield 27. Are we sure we've got that covered in the presentation?" I stopped on the pavement, the city's chaotic ballets swirling around me. I set my box down. This was the moment. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb hovering over the screen. The live audio file was streaming directly to my secure cloud storage, but I wanted a physical copy, an air-gapped backup. There was a pause on the call. I could almost hear Grayson smiling, leaning forward conspiratorially. He lowered his voice, but the ghost mic was sensitive enough to catch every syllable, every nuance of his treachery. "Don't worry about that," Grayson said, his voice now a low, intimate murmur intended for his trusted circle. "I've already adjusted the model. For the purposes of this meeting and for the board, the 27 field adjustment is minor, a non-issue, just a standard deviation. They don't need to know the details. They'll never audit that deep anyway." My breath caught in my throat. It was more perfect than I could have ever hoped. It was a confession, a motive, and a conspiracy, all wrapped in a neat little bow of corporate arrogance. My thumb moved. I initiated the download, routing the encrypted audio stream directly to the small solid-state drive I had palmed in my coat pocket. On the screen, a thin blue line began to crawl from left to right, a digital transfer of power, a silent theft in broad daylight. The rest of the call was just noise, the triumphant chatter of men who thought they had won. I stood on that sidewalk, a ghost haunting her own past, and waited for the download to complete. The blue line reached the end of the screen. A small icon flashed, transfer complete. A few minutes later, I heard Grayson wrap up the call. "Excellent work, everyone," he boomed. "Let's go make history." The line went silent. I slipped the hard drive back into my pocket. It felt warm to the touch. I looked up at the gleaming, monolithic tower of Denton Vale, a $100 billion monument to the kind of ambition that mistakes crime for genius. Grayson hadn't just ended a phone call. He had just signed a legal affidavit detailing his own fraud, and I, the woman he had just erased, was now the sole notary, prosecutor, and judge. He had just handed me the weapon, the ammunition, and a signed warrant for his own destruction. It was 11:12 a.m. I was an anonymous woman in a dark coat, a ghost haunting Madison Avenue with a cardboard box of a former life resting on my hip. The city was a cacophony of sirens, shouting, and the rumble of unseen subways, but in my ears there was only one sound playing on a clean, crisp loop. It was the voice of Grayson Bell. I had found a small, recessed public plaza, a tiny granite oasis amidst the steel and glass canyons, and sat on a cold stone bench. With my headphones on, the chaotic symphony of the city faded into a dull roar, a backdrop for the private concert I was attending. I listened to the recording of the 10 o'clock call for the third time. Every word was a note in his symphony of self-destruction, his confident swagger, his casual dismissal of my work, his paternalistic lies. Each syllable was a brushstroke in the portrait of a fool. And then came the crescendo, the part I replayed the most, the part that had transformed from mere audio into a tangible weapon. His voice, lowered to a conspiratorial murmur, filled my head. It's just paper adjustments. They'll never audit that deep. The arrogance was breathtaking. He believed he was invincible, protected by his title, his charisma, and the silent complicity of the men around him. He thought his words, once spoken, would dissipate into the ether, forgotten. He failed to understand that in my world, the digital world, nothing is ever forgotten. Words spoken in private rooms can be captured, stored, and replayed in rooms full of judges. Sound can be weaponized. I pulled out my phone. My fingers were steady, my movements precise. I opened a secure file transfer application. First, I created a new encrypted container on the solid-state drive in my pocket, a clean, sterile copy of the audio file. Then I uploaded a second copy to a personal off-site server I maintained under a pseudonym, a digital vault I'd built years ago for my most sensitive personal documents. I named the folder Echo Vault. If they somehow found and destroyed the first copy, this one would remain. If they came after me, a dead man's switch was already in place to release the contents to a curated list of journalists and regulators. Redundancy was the first rule of data integrity. It was also the first rule of revenge. Just as the upload completed, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. My heart didn't leap. My focus simply narrowed. It was from a number I knew well, Clara Jennings, the executive assistant to the Denton Vale Board of Directors. Clara was a woman of immense quiet competence, one of the few people in the executive wing who operated on a plane of pure, apolitical efficiency. I had always treated her with the respect she deserved, and in return, she had always been a reliable source of information. The message was simple, professional, a courtesy she would have extended to me yesterday as a matter of course. Today, it was the key. Clara J., just so you're aware, Lydia, Board's quarterly review link just went live. They're convening in 5 minutes. My fingers flew across the screen. My reply, a carefully constructed blend of nonchalance and professional curiosity. Me, thanks, Clara. Appreciate the heads up. Hope it goes smoothly. I paused for a beat, then typed the crucial question. Me, they're using Blue Wire for it? The 3 dots indicating she was typing appeared almost instantly. It felt like watching a fuse burn. This was the fulcrum upon which the entire plan rested. If they had switched to a different system out of some latent paranoia, my plan was dead. But Grayson was arrogant, and arrogant men are lazy. They don't sweat the small stuff. And to him, the teleconference system was the smallest of stuff. The reply came. Clara J., yes. Same server link as the last few meetings. Grayson insisted on keeping it simple. I read the words, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of grim, absolute certainty, the kind of smile a mathematician has when a complex proof resolves into a simple, elegant solution. He had walked right back into the trap. Me, good. I sent the single word and then switched apps. I opened a secure browser and navigated to the Blue Wire Conf administrative login portal. My executive credentials had been revoked, but my top-level systems administrator account, the one tied to the original installation and maintenance contract, was still active. An oversight, a fatal one. I entered my credentials. The screen changed, displaying the system's back-end interface, a clean, minimalist dashboard of servers, active calls, and scheduled meetings. I saw the board meeting status, convening. I saw the participant list, populated with the names of the most powerful people in the company. My name was not among them. I was a ghost in the machine. Their machine, my machine. My fingers moved with practiced speed. I navigated to the server-side audio cache. There it was, a file labeled with the timestamp of the 10 o'clock call, audio capture, 10:02 a.m. It was over an hour old, scheduled to be automatically purged by the system in another few hours. But for now, it was still there, a digital landmine waiting to be armed. I didn't download it. I didn't move it. I simply selected it. Then I went to the administrative controls for the live board meeting. I found the master audio input settings. The default source was set to room Mic-Array Boardroom 40. I clicked the drop-down menu. A list of options appeared. I scrolled past the standard inputs until I found the one I was looking for, playback from server cache. I selected it. A new field appeared asking for a source file. I linked it to audio captured 10:02 a.m. One final setting, playback mode. The default was play once. I changed it to loop. I hit apply. A small green check mark appeared next to the setting. It was done. The trap was set. I closed the browser, wiped the cache, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I stood up, picking up the cardboard box. The city's noise rushed back in, but it sounded different now. It sounded like an overture. In a few minutes, the chairman of the board would call the quarterly review to order. Grayson Bell, the triumphant CEO, would clear his throat and prepare to deliver his masterpiece of deception. He would open his mouth to speak, and the system would obey the last command it had received. The microphones in the room would be inert. Instead of his live voice, the speakers would broadcast the recording from his last meeting. They would hear his lies about me. They would hear his conspiracy. And then they would hear his own voice, in his own words, confessing to the very fraud he was about to deny. And when it finished, it would start again and again. An endless, repeating echo of his own guilt. I didn't need to leak a document. I didn't need to call a reporter. I didn't need to say another word. He was about to say everything for me. I found a small, soulless coffee shop directly across the street from the Denton Vale Tower. It was the kind of place that prided itself on artisanal beans but served everything in paper cups. A transient space for people on their way to somewhere more important. For me, it was the perfect observation post. I chose a small table by the window, placed my cardboard box of personal effects on the floor beside me, and ordered a black Americano. I had no intention of drinking it. My phone was on the table, face up. The building across the street loomed in my vision, a silent, impassive monolith of glass and steel, its face reflecting the afternoon's sun. It looked serene, invulnerable. But I knew that on its 40th floor, a war was about to begin. My phone screen lit up at 10:03 a.m. A text from Clara. Clara J., meeting is called to order. Chairman giving opening remarks. Grayson is on deck. I imagined the scene. The long, polished obsidian table, the dozen members of the board of directors, titans of industry and finance, men and one woman who measured their time in $100,000 increments. They would be sipping ice water from heavy crystal glasses, their faces impassive masks of professional scrutiny. And at the head of the table, Grayson Bell would be standing, radiating the easy, predatory confidence that had gotten him this far. He was about to give the performance of his life, selling them on a $3.1 billion lie. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity, 10:04, 10:05. I pictured Grayson deep into his opening, his voice smooth and reassuring, the presentation slides clicking by, filled with upward trending charts and glowing projections. He would be charming them, winning them over just as he had won everyone over. At 10:07 a.m., my world, and his, tilted on its axis. It didn't start with a text message. It started with a subtle shift in the body language of the building itself. I saw a flurry of movement behind the 40th floor windows, figures moving in a way that was not typical for a board meeting. It was too agitated, too sudden. A moment later, my phone buzzed. It was Clara. The text was a single, frantic sentence. Clara J., something is wrong with the audio, playing a recording. I felt a cold, clean thrill. It was working. I typed back, my finger steady. Me, what kind of recording? I already knew the answer. I could feel the sound waves crossing the street, feel them vibrating in the very air. The response from Clara came laced with digital panic. Clara J., it's Grayson's voice from an earlier call. I think something about investor trust. He's talking about you. Yes, he was. He was performing his act of character assassination for a second time, only this time to a much more critical audience. Clara J., now it's something else. A line about environmental risks. He's telling them not to worry. I could picture the scene with perfect clarity. The board members exchanging puzzled glances, the chairman, a stern man named Arthur Vance, leaning forward, his brow furrowed, listening intently. Grayson would be standing, frozen, his face draining of color as he recognized his own voice, his own secret words playing back at him like a ghost. Clara J., oh my God, he just said the board doesn't need to know about the 27 field adjustment. I took another sip of coffee. It was cold now. Outside, the city roared on, oblivious. A taxi honked. A bicycle messenger weaved through traffic. But in my small corner of this coffee shop, the world had gone silent, focused on the tiny, glowing screen of my phone. Clara J., it's starting over. The whole thing is playing again. Same words. The part about you. This was the crucial moment. The first time, it was a glitch, an anomaly. The second time, it was a pattern. The third time, it would be understood as a deliberate act. These were not men who believed in coincidence. They saw patterns in stock charts, in geopolitical events, in human behavior. They would understand the pattern here. This wasn't an error. It was evidence. My phone buzzed again. A new message thread. This one was from a number I didn't recognize, but the preview was all I needed to see. It was Dave, the sycophantic VP. Lydia, call me now. Urgent. I ignored it. Other notifications began to pop up, frantic messages from former colleagues, all asking what was happening. I swiped them all away. There was only one conversation that mattered. Clara J., no one is talking. The room is dead silent. Grayson is just standing there. He looks sick. Arthur Vance is staring at him, not with anger, with contempt. I could feel the power in the room shifting, the tectonic plates of corporate authority grinding against each other, preparing to shatter. Grayson's charisma, his confidence, his entire carefully constructed persona was being dismantled, layer by layer, by his own disembodied voice. Then came the text I had been waiting for, the one that told me they knew, or at least they suspected. Clara J., what did you do? The question was direct, an accusation wrapped in 3 words. She knew I'd been fired. She knew I was the subject of the recording. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. I held my finger over the screen for a long moment, savoring it. Then I typed my reply, a sentence of perfect, beautiful, devastating simplicity. Me, I just pressed play. The response was immediate. The 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. She didn't know how to reply. She didn't have to. At 1:19 p.m., I saw it with my own eyes. A single figure, a man in a dark suit, stood up from the long table on the 40th floor and walked swiftly out of the boardroom. He entered a corner office, and I saw him raise a phone to his ear. It was Kenji Tanaka, the board member representing their largest institutional investor. He wasn't calling IT, he was calling his lawyers, he was protecting his capital. The first rat was leaving the sinking ship. The dominoes began to fall. 3 minutes later at 1:22 p.m., Clara's final message of the hour appeared. It wasn't a question or an observation. It was a news bulletin, a death notice. Clara J., it's over. Vance just adjourned. An emergency session is being called. A public statement is being drafted. Board suspends acquisition pending immediate internal review. I read the message once, then twice. I leaned back in my cheap chair and looked out the window at the tower. From the outside, it was still just a building. The sun still glinted off its mirrored skin. But I knew that inside it was a tomb. A $3.1 billion deal had just died. A CEO's career had just ended. An entire corporate strategy had just evaporated into thin air. I did not smile. I did not feel a rush of victory. I felt a profound, quiet calm, the cold, satisfying click of a perfectly executed equation. The truth had been entered into the system, and the system had produced the correct result. I picked up my phone and silenced it, dropping it into my coat pocket. The show was over. All that was left was the fallout. And so I sat alone in a noisy coffee shop across the street, watching the magnificent, silent edifice of Denton Vale Energy. And I waited. The calm didn't last. The silence was a held breath, and the moment the boardroom door had closed on the aborted meeting, the world exhaled in a hurricane of digital noise aimed directly at me. My phone, which I had placed back on the coffee shop table, began to vibrate with such relentless intensity it skittered across the polished surface like a dying insect. The screen was a cascading waterfall of notifications, a frantic, desperate attempt to reach the ghost they had created. The call log was the first testament to the panic. Grayson Bell. Missed call. Then, again and again. By the time I stopped counting, the log read 14. 14 desperate, unanswered pleas from the man who, less than 2 hours ago, had coolly informed me that my services were no longer required. Then came the texts, each one a snapshot of a mind unraveling in real time. From Grayson Bell, call me now. From Grayson Bell, you have no idea the damage you've done. This is corporate espionage. From Grayson Bell, we can fix this. Lydia, there has been a misunderstanding. Let's talk. From Grayson Bell, I know you're seeing these. Don't be a fool. From Grayson Bell, name your price. Anything. We can make this right. I read the messages, a clinical dissection of a man devolving from rage to threats to bargaining to pleading. It was pathetic. He still believed this was a transaction, that there was a number that could rewind the clock and make the truth unspoken. He didn't understand. This was never about money. It was about acoustics. I just wanted his words to be heard in the right room. I silenced his contact thread and let the phone continue its frantic dance. Next came the official response, the lumbering charge of the corporate immune system. An email arrived, flagged with a red exclamation point for urgency. The sender was Sarah Jenkins from Human Resources, but the language was the cold, sterile prose of the legal department. The subject line was immediate cease and desist. The body was a dense forest of legally threatening injunctions, civil damages, and criminal prosecution for the theft and dissemination of proprietary company information. It was a standard, brutish attempt at intimidation, a legal cudgel designed to frighten a disgruntled ex-employee into silence. They assumed I was emotional. They assumed I was scared. They assumed I hadn't read my own employment contract. I didn't bother to write a lengthy reply. I didn't engage with their threats. I simply hit reply all, ensuring General Counsel Marcus Thorne was included. In the body of the email, I wrote nothing. I just copied and pasted a single clause from the non-disclosure agreement they had tried to make me sign that morning, Section 7 billions. Confidentiality obligations as outlined in this agreement shall be rendered null and void in the event of a unilateral for-cause dismissal of the employee where said cause is later determined to be unsubstantiated or pretextual. I hit send. It was the legal equivalent of returning a grenade with the pin pulled. It was my way of saying, you fired me for overstepping, a pretext for silencing my warnings of your own fraud. The NDA is void. Your threats are meaningless. Checkmate. At 2:04 p.m., the first public sign of the meltdown appeared. I was scrolling through a financial news feed when I noticed it. The official Denton Vale Energy corporate Twitter feed, usually a relentless stream of self-congratulatory press releases and articles about green energy initiatives, had gone silent. The last post was from yesterday. I checked their LinkedIn page. The same. The PR department, facing a crisis they couldn't spin, had pulled the plug. They had gone into a defensive crouch, a digital bunker, hoping to wait out the storm. But the storm was just beginning. At 2:11 p.m., I opened my stock tracking app. The ticker for Denton Vale Energy, DV, was no longer green. It was a screaming, bloody red, a sheer cliff face plunging downward. It was down 12%, then 13%. The market, that great amoral beast that cares for nothing but data, was reacting. The whispers coming out of that boardroom were turning into a sell-off cascade. Billions of dollars in shareholder value erased in the time it took to listen to a 3-minute recording. A colleague from my old team, a young analyst who I knew was loyal, sent me a grainy cell phone video. It was a recording of a recording, an emergency internal broadcast Grayson was making to all employees. He was standing at a podium, looking pale and gaunt under the harsh office lights. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a rigid, sweaty terror. "We are currently experiencing a significant technical breach," he was saying, his voice strained. "It appears a malicious external actor has gained unauthorized access to our internal communication systems. The board is aware, and we are working with cybersecurity experts to contain this illegal intrusion." A malicious external actor. That was me, the woman he had fired this morning. I watched him lie to his own employees, trying to frame his own malfeasance as a foreign attack. But it was too late. Someone from inside that boardroom had already leaked the audio. A push notification from a major financial news outlet confirmed it. The headline was a dagger. Denton Vale CEO caught on tape appearing to mislead board on $3.1 billion Ousted deal. It was no longer a question. It was a statement. The story was out. The truth was free. The frantic calls and messages had stopped. My phone had fallen silent, the initial shockwave of their panic having passed, Now they were regrouping, calculating, trying to salvage the wreckage. The silence was more unnerving than the noise had been. It was the quiet of predators circling, deciding who to sacrifice to the pack. At 3:06 p.m., the summons came. It was a text from Clara. Her tone was no longer frantic. It was formal, devoid of any emotion, the voice of the board. Clara J., the board of directors formally requests to speak with you at your earliest convenience. They were no longer threatening me. They were requesting an audience. The power dynamic had been inverted completely. I was no longer the fired employee, the malicious actor. I was the star witness. They needed me. They needed my testimony. They needed the evidence that I possessed. They thought all I had was the one recording. They were about to discover how wrong they were. I held the phone, considering my response. I could hire a lawyer. I could demand a settlement. I could make them grovel. But again, this was not about me. It was about the data, the unalterable truth. I would not give them my voice. I would give them the facts in their purest, most undeniable form. I typed my reply. A single sentence that I knew would land in that emergency board meeting like a second, even more devastating explosion. Me, send them the Echo folder. I attached a secure, one-time use link to the encrypted Echo Vault I had created. It contained everything: my original, unedited reports, the doctored *revised.xlsx file with Grayson's admin timestamp, the emails where he told me to tone down the negative assumptions, every audio file, every piece of the mosaic of his fraud, meticulously collected and preserved. I was not just giving them the smoking gun, I was giving them the factory where the gun was made, the blueprints and the signed receipts for the bullets. I hit send, and then a profound and total silence. No reply from Clara, no more calls, no more emails. The digital storm had passed. I looked out the window at the tower. It was just a building again, an edifice of glass and steel, but inside I knew my email had just landed. I knew they were opening the link. I knew the truth was finally, fully and irrevocably in the room. All that was left was the breaking of glass. The silence that followed my email was the heavy, compressed quiet that comes before a tidal wave. For nearly 2 hours, the world held its breath. I had left the coffee shop, abandoning the cold dregs of my Americano, and started walking. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to move, to feel the city's rhythm, the solid pavement under my feet, the cardboard box, a clumsy reminder of my own eviction, I had left in a public locker at Penn Station. I was untethered, a free agent in a city of millions. My phone, now quiet, felt like a dormant weapon in my pocket. At exactly 5:02 p.m., it rang. The screen displayed a blocked, unknown number. I knew who it was. I stepped off the bustling sidewalk into a small, quiet alcove in front of an old stone church, the sounds of traffic and sirens softening into a distant roar. I let it ring 3 times, a small assertion of control. Then I answered, Lydia Hart. My voice was even, calm. The voice on the other end was like gravel poured over ice. It was deep, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. Miss Hart, this is Robert Denning. I am the independent counsel retained by the board of directors of Denton Vale Energy. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if this was a good time. He stated his name and purpose. He was a cleaner, a man brought in to deal with messy situations, and this was the messiest he had likely seen in years. I understand, Mr. Denning, I replied, my tone matching his, professional, clinical. We have received the files you sent to the board's assistant, he began. We need your official statement regarding the materials contained therein and the events of this morning. I can provide that, I said. A faint scratching sound came through the line, a pen on a legal pad. Please proceed, he said from the beginning. And so I began to read. I was not telling a story. I was not making an appeal for sympathy. I was presenting a data set, a chronological log of corporate malfeasance. My voice was a monotone, the same voice I used to present quarterly risk assessments. On August 14th, at 9:22 a.m., I began. I submitted my initial risk report on the Orstar acquisition to CEO Grayson Bell. The report file name, risk_model_Orstar_by1_final.pdf, contained in the folder. You have flagged a material discrepancy in the valuation of the asset designated Wellfield 27. On August 15th, at 11:03 a.m., I received an email in reply from Mr. Bell. I will quote the relevant line. Lydia, we need to change the narrative here. Tone down the negative assumptions. I continued, a human machine reciting the evidence. I gave him the date I was removed from the audit meetings. I gave him the file names and timestamps of the altered reports I was asked to transcribe. My recitation was relentless, a drumbeat of facts, each one a nail in Grayson's corporate coffin. On October 3rd, at approximately 11:10 p.m., I ran a server log diagnostic for the MNA master file directory. The log file name, server_log_ma13.txt in your possession, shows a file modification at 2:17 a.m. that morning. The modified file was orstar.revised. The authorized user was gbell.admin. Denning said nothing. The only sound from his end was the steady, dry scratch of his pen. He was not interrupting. He was not questioning. He was simply absorbing the overwhelming, meticulously documented evidence of the fraud. I was not just giving him accusations. I was giving him the receipts. Finally, I reached the events of the morning. I described being fired, the reason given, and the exact time. I then described the 10:02 a.m. call that Grayson had held with his team. I recounted verbatim the key phrases from the recording, his slander against me and his confession. At approximately 10:15 a.m., Mr. Bell stated, "The board doesn't need to know about the 27 field adjustment. It's minor. They'll never audit that deep anyway." End quote. I finished. The scratching of the pen stopped. The line was silent. I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible hiss of the connection. For a long time, he said nothing. He was processing not just the information, but the sheer, cold competence of its delivery. Then he asked the question that I knew was the only one that truly mattered to him as a lawyer. "Ms. Hart," he said, his voice still a careful monotone, "did you intentionally record the call this morning?" He was looking for an angle, a way to poison the well. If I had actively, illegally recorded a private conversation, he could argue the evidence was inadmissible, tainted. He could try to shift the focus from their crime to mine. I took a breath. I looked up at the sky, a darkening shade of blue above the stone gargoyles of the church. I chose my words with the same precision I used to build a financial model. The Blue Wire comp system, as per the compliance and archival protocols I myself designed and implemented in 2023, automatically records all high-level M&A and investor relations calls to a secondary compliance server. The recording of the 10 a.m. meeting was initiated by this automated system protocol. I paused, letting that sink in. Then I delivered the final, critical sentence. I didn't start it. I just didn't stop it. The words hung in the air between us, and then there was silence. It was not a pause. It was a vacuum, a profound and total absence of sound from his end of the line. I started counting in my head, 1, 2, 3. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I could hear the traffic on Fifth Avenue, the distant wail of a siren. I could hear my own steady breathing, 4, 5, 6. In that silence, I understood everything. It was the sound of a master strategist realizing he had been outplayed, the sound of a lawyer recognizing a perfectly constructed, legally airtight truth. My statement was a fortress. I had not broken any laws. I had simply allowed the company's own legally mandated compliance system to function as designed. They had fired the only person who knew how to turn it off and then walked right into its path. The fault was not mine. It was theirs, their incompetence, their arrogance. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. After 12 eternal seconds, he finally spoke. The gravel in his voice seemed to have been ground a little finer. "I see," he said. The two words were freighted with a universe of meaning. It was an admission of defeat. "Thank you for your statement, Miss Hart. The board will review this information internally." The call ended at 6:10 p.m. It had lasted just over an hour. They had what they needed. I started walking again, heading east. The sun was setting, and the late afternoon light was turning the city a burnished golden orange. The notification came at 6:27 p.m. It was a news alert from a financial wire service. Denton Vale Energy CEO Grayson Bell placed on indefinite administrative leave following emergency board meeting. Acquisition of Orstar Resources suspended. I was standing on a pedestrian overpass, a steel bridge arching over the churning river of traffic below. In the distance, the Denton Vale Tower stood like a dark headstone against the fiery sky. The windows on its upper floors were still lit, pockets of frantic activity in a dying empire. I looked at that building, that symbol of my past life, of my erasure, and now of my vindication. I felt no joy. I felt no anger. I felt only a quiet, profound finality. The sun was sinking below the horizon, and the brilliant orange light bathing the side of the tower was fading to a deep, bruised purple. The day was over, and I knew with absolute certainty that the sun had just set on Grayson Bell. The 2 days that followed were a study in suspended animation. The world was screaming about Denton Vale, but my own life had fallen into a profound silence. The news cycle was a feeding frenzy. Financial pundits dissected the stock's precipitous fall. Legal experts debated the board's liability, and anonymous sources from within the company leaked contradictory rumors to any journalist who would listen. I watched it all from a detached distance, a spectator to a fire I had started, observing the blaze from a neighboring hill. I walked for miles through the city's anonymous streets, bought groceries from a corner market, and sat in the park watching children play. I was a ghost in my own life, waiting for the official pronouncement of a death that I knew had already occurred. The verdict arrived on Sunday afternoon, not with a personal call but with the cold, impersonal formality of a corporate press release. It was posted on a hastily erected investor information page on the Denton Vale website, a digital quarantine zone designed to contain the contagion. The language was sterile, scrubbed clean of all human drama by a team of lawyers and PR consultants, but the meaning was as clear as a death certificate. The board, following an emergency session, had voted unanimously to terminate the $3.1 billion merger agreement with Ousted Resources, citing material misrepresentations discovered during final due diligence. They announced the formation of an independent special committee, helmed by a famously ruthless former U.S. attorney, to conduct a full and thorough investigation into the company's accounting practices and disclosure protocols. The final paragraph was a masterpiece of corporate capitulation, stating that the company had proactively reached out to the relevant regulatory authorities to offer our full cooperation. The SEC was now officially in play. The press, never one for subtlety, had already branded the affair. Every headline, every chyron on the 24-hour news networks used the same phrase, the $3.1 billion collapse. The number that had once been a symbol of Grayson's visionary genius was now the epitaph on his corporate gravestone. An hour after the press release went live, a formal email landed in my personal inbox. The sender was Robert Denning. His tone was different now. The icy, surgical precision was still there, but it was layered with a new, careful deference. He was no longer speaking to a fired employee. He was speaking to the state's primary witness. "Ms. Hart," it began. "In light of the investigation now underway, the special committee of the board formally requests that you provide a complete, unedited copy of all documentation in your possession related to the Ousted Resources acquisition. Your full cooperation in this matter will be duly noted." Your cooperation will be noted. It was a phrase pregnant with meaning. It was a promise and a warning, an offer of a future carrot and the implicit threat of a stick. They were acknowledging my leverage. They knew I held the definitive, untainted record. They needed my evidence to cauterize the wound, to prove to the regulators and the market that they were serious about cleaning house. They needed me to help them bury Grayson so the company itself could survive. I did not reply immediately. I waited until after dark. I went to a quiet 24-hour library at the university, a place of studious silence and the hushed whisper of turning pages. I sat at a deserted carrel, the glow of my new laptop a small pool of light in the dim stacks. There, I prepared my final transmission. I logged into the Echo Vault and began the process of compiling every file, the multiple versions of my risk models, the server logs, the complete unedited audio files, the email chains, the doctored spreadsheet. It was the entire story, told in the cold, clean language of metadata and timestamps. I packaged it all into a single, heavily encrypted container. I named the file Echo Final. Before I attached it to my reply, I added one last document. It was a text file, a simple memo I had written to myself a week ago after Grayson had accused me of being emotional. I had saved it in my personal log, a quiet declaration of my own principles. It was never intended for anyone else to see, but now it felt like the only appropriate signature for the entire package. The document contained a single sentence: "If telling the truth cost me my job, so be it." I attached the Echo Final container to my reply to Robert Denning. In the body of the email, I wrote only 2 words: "As requested." I hit send. The file, a digital cannonball of pure, unassailable fact, shot across the ether into the heart of the Denton Vale boardroom. My part was done. The last of my evidence had been delivered. I packed up my laptop and walked out into the cool night air. As I was waiting for the subway, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Clara. It was not a formal communication. It was a quiet, back-channel message from one colleague to another. The subject line was blank. The email contained a single line: "They're removing him from the building tomorrow morning. It's over." I read the words on the brightly lit subway platform, the screech of an incoming train filling the tunnel. He was being officially, permanently erased. His nameplate would be removed from the door. His pictures would come down from the walls. His digital ghost would be purged from the servers. It was the corporate death penalty. I stared at the screen at Clara's simple, declarative sentence. It was the period at the end of a long, ugly chapter. I felt a sudden, overwhelming need for silence. I pressed the power button on the side of my phone and held it down. The screen prompted me to confirm. I slid my finger across the glass. The screen flickered once, then went dark. I was disconnected. That night, for the first time in 7 years, I slept without the phantom limb of my job attached to me. My mind was not running threat assessments or stress-testing market variables. I was not listening for the faint, high-pitched ping of a system failure alert from a server halfway around the world. The constant, low-grade hum of vigilance that had been the soundtrack to my life for as long as I could remember was finally gone. There was only quiet. And in that quiet, as I drifted into a deep and dreamless sleep, the last conscious thought that formed in my mind was not one of triumph or revenge, or even relief. It was a simple, profound, and deeply satisfying fact, the resolution to the entire complex equation they heard him. Monday morning broke over Manhattan, a clean, cold slate of a day. The city hummed with its usual relentless energy, a symphony of purpose and ambition. For most, it was just the start of another week. For me, it was the epilogue. The news had already broken, a digital shockwave that had rippled across the financial world over the weekend and was now the lead story on every morning broadcast. I saw it on the screen of a television in a deli window as I bought a coffee I wouldn't drink. Denton Vale CEO fired amid $3.1 billion fraud probe. The headline was stark, brutal, and beautiful. I didn't go home. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the scene of the crime. I was sitting on a cold, wrought-iron bench in the small, manicured park directly across from the Denton Vale Tower. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows and glinting off the thousands of windows of the building, making it look like a pillar of cold fire. From this distance, it looked just as it always had, powerful, permanent, indifferent, a monument to capital. My phone, which I had turned back on this morning, began to ring. I pulled it from my pocket. The screen showed a blocked number. It rang and rang, a shrill, insistent plea in the quiet morning air. It could have been anyone, a lawyer, a reporter, a former colleague. I didn't care. I silenced the ringer and let the screen go dark, placing the phone beside me on the bench. I was done talking. All the talking that needed to be done was already finished. I just sat and watched. I watched the flow of employees heading into the lobby, a river of dark suits and briefcases. They walked with their heads down, their pace hurried. The mood was different today. The usual confident stride of the masters of the universe was gone, replaced by the nervous, furtive energy of survivors in a disaster zone. They were walking into a building whose soul had been ripped out over the weekend. And then I saw him. It was not a grand, dramatic exit. There was no phalanx of security, no scrum of reporters waiting at the door. The real drama had already happened in the silent, carpeted confines of the 40th floor. This was just the final, quiet, humiliating ritual of expulsion. The main elevator doors in the lobby opened, and Grayson Bell stepped out. He was alone. In his arms, he carried a single, standard-issue cardboard box, the same kind I had been given. It was overflowing with the personal detritus of a corner office, a framed photograph, a small desk plant, a tangle of charging cables. He paused just inside the glass doors, and for a moment, he looked lost. His face, usually tanned and animated with a winner's smile, was the color of old parchment. His shoulders, which he always held squared and proud, were slumped. The bespoke suit, which had once seemed like a suit of armor, now hung on him like a costume that was 2 sizes too big. He was no longer a CEO. He was just a man who had lost his job. He took a deep breath, a visible effort, and pushed his way through the revolving doors, stepping out onto the sidewalk. The morning sun hit his face, and he flinched as if the light itself were an accusation. His eyes, accustomed to the filtered artificial light of the executive suite, scanned the street, the park, the world that was no longer his. And then he saw me. Across the expanse of the street, through the steady stream of yellow taxis and black town cars, our eyes met. He froze, one hand still on the revolving door. In that moment, the entire chaotic city seemed to fall away. There was only the silent, unbridgeable space between us. I did not move. I did not smile. I did not react at all. I simply looked at him, my expression a calm, placid mirror reflecting his own ruin. I saw a flicker of emotions race across his face, shock, a flash of the old impotent rage, and then something else, something I had never seen in him before, the blank, hollowed-out look of utter defeat. He understood. In that single, silent gaze, he understood that this was not a negotiation. This was not a battle he could win with charm or threats. This was a final, irreversible outcome, a risk that had been realized. He looked away first. As if on cue, a large white van with a satellite dish on its roof pulled to a screeching halt at the curb beside him. The side door slid open, and a cameraman jumped out, hoisting a large broadcast camera onto his shoulder. The lens, a single dark, unblinking eye, swiveled and focused on Grayson. The spell was broken. Grayson seemed to shrink, pulling his coat tighter around himself as if to ward off a sudden chill. He turned away from me, away from the camera, and began to walk, his head down, a disgraced king hurrying into exile. I stood up from the bench. I adjusted the collar of my own coat, a simple, final gesture. My work here was done. I turned and began to walk away, melting into the anonymous morning crowd, just another face moving through the city. And then I heard it, a sound that was both familiar and new. The news van, preparing for its live shot, was testing its external speaker system, and the audio they chose to play, a teaser for the story to come, was a soundbite, a single damning piece of audio that had now become infamous. Grayson Bell's voice, my recording of his voice, echoed across the plaza, amplified for the entire world to hear. It was clear, condescending, and fatally arrogant. They'll never audit that deep. The sound washed over me as I walked away, and I smiled. It was not the sharp, bitter smile of revenge. It was the quiet, satisfied smile of a risk analyst watching a complex model perform exactly as predicted. The truth didn't need me to shout. It didn't need my anger or my pain. It just needed a microphone. And once it was recorded, it had a life of its own. It just needed to be heard. The audio clip ended, cutting off into an abrupt, perfect silence. Thank you so much for listening to my story.